Warning, the following program may contain coarse language, strong violence, and brief sexuality. This video is designed for a mature audience, and viewer discretion is advised. Childe of Shade Reviews, Review Number 3, Persona 3, Movie Number 1, Spring of Birth. Adaptations can be very hard beasts to tame. With an adaptation, there are several factors that come into play, and it can be challenging to decide what stays and what goes out. Do you follow the source material strictly and never stray from it to keep fans happy, a la the first couple of Harry Potter films, or do you use the source material loosely as a foundation for you to build upon, and create your own spin on something? See Dante's Inferno. History has provided a few examples of adaptations rising far and above the popularity or critical acclaim of their source material, but that does happen rarely. Today for Childe of Shade Reviews, we will be taking a look at AIC's adaptation of the 2007 cult classic Shin Megami Tensei Persona 3, which is, might I add, a very dear game to me. Does the first part of this trilogy serve as a messiah for Persona fans to follow, or should the Cease member hang up their evokers for good? Ladies and gentlemen, set your watches, grab your evokers, and step forth into the dark hour. Our story begins with our hero, Makoto Yuki, throwing himself in front of the train, killing himself instantly. Just kidding, but seriously, why was that scene in there exactly? But for real this time, our story begins with Makoto Yuki, our protagonist, stepping off the train and walking to his dorm in Adawada City. Seemingly unfazed by the large amount of coffins lying around with a sickly green hue in the sky, Yuki walks into his dorm to be met by a mysterious young boy who asks him to sign a contract reading that he will take full responsibility for his actions. After signing said contract, the boy disappears, and Yuki is then strangely approached by fellow students and dorm mates Hikari Takiba and Mitsuru Kirijo. They greet him, then point him to his room, and the next day, Yuki is led to his new school, Gekudan High School. From there, life seems to go normally, until he is woken in the middle of the night by Yukari telling him that the dorm is under attack. They flee to the roof of the dorm, only to find that they are being pursued by mysterious beings known as shadows. Yukari tries to fight one of these shadows, but is instead knocked into her corner and drops her weapon. Here, Yuki uses this weapon, known as an invoker, to summon forth his persona Orpheus, who fights said shadow and comes out victorious. Yuki passes out, then wakes up a week later to a worried Yukari. Yuki is then introduced to the club known as Cease, where he continues to fight shadows with his newly awakened powers for the rest of the movie. And that's kind of where the plot ends. For the sake of fairness, I'm going to try to keep comparisons to the game as little as possible, because adaptations should be able to stand on their own and not constantly be compared to their source material. However, in terms of trying to convey a narrative, Spring of Birth succeeds just about as well as 90s beat-em-ups in terms of significance. There really isn't a clear motivations for these characters to be fighting these shadows, and other than they're bad things and bad things should die, explanations for plots like the Velvet Room, Apathy Syndrome, the Midnight Hour, and Cease are never brought up, and as a result, only fans of the game will truly understand what's going on. Now some of you are saying, hey, this is only the first movie and we still got two more left after this. Stop your complaining and just enjoy what we got right now. While I do somewhat agree with that statement, I feel that the whole point of the trilogy was to equally distribute information and plot points across the span of 3 pieces of media, and Spring of Birth just fails to do that properly as an introduction. As with Persona 4 the animation, the pacing feels incredibly rushed, and important scenes that should be spent providing information and an incentive to care tend to only be a couple minutes long. Even worse is the fact that the final third of the movie is spent way too long on one scene in a drawn-out effort to provide a climax. It's remarkably clear that not much happens in the first third of this trilogy, and as a result, the film suffers by just being boring. I definitely felt that the film could have done a better job of conveying its story, but butchering the character interactions and exposition really dampens the film and just gives viewers little to no reason to care. Speaking of which, Perhaps the most disappointing aspect of this film is the way these characters are presented and how they interact with each other. Characters that are not Makoto hardly get any screen time, and the only person who gets to spend most of the time with him is Fuka, a support character that will probably get very little actual screen time when the rest of the films are aired. Now, I'm not saying Fuka is a bad character, even though her English voice acting could use a little work.
I have a feeling that death is near. Be careful.
I just felt that development should have been spread across more of the characters, and that mainly just focusing on one won't make us care more. Junpei and Yukari barely get any screen time with our protagonists, and it's the same with the rest of the cast. I understand that Junpei's, Yukari's, and other members of C's full arcs won't come until later in the films, but a little bit more time spent with them could have made a whole world of difference in the execution. However, by far the biggest and most disappointing aspect of this department is our main lead, Makoto. Rather than going in the Yu Narukami route and just making our protagonist a relatable and somewhat witty blank slate caricature, AIC instead opted for an antisocial and emotionless asshole of a character. Makoto throughout the movie never grows or develops as a character and instead just whines and complains about not having any reason to care about anything, and he just doesn't give a damn, and there's no real stake when it comes to doing what he does, which is rather hypocritical. Seriously, that's all he does, and when other more interesting characters call him out on it, he just shrugs it off and walks away. He only once questioned why he's compelled to take action against the shadows, and that's only towards the end of the movie, aka far too long. If there was some sort of development here, I would just shrug this off and think that the movie is just waiting to provide the best scenes for the later films, but there's none, absolutely none, and that's what kills this movie for me. One of the cornerstones of the Persona series is its development of its characters throughout the game and how they grow and expand throughout the narrative, and to see this movie of one of the better games in the series decide to do as little of this as possible and instead just focus it on a practically non-existent plot which only fans will understand is more than a tad bit frustrating. I understand that he was a blank slate before and that it's hard to make a decision about what you're going to do with that kind of character, but there are better ways than this. Unfortunately, that's really all I have to say because of how little there is. I understand that this is a movie, so time has to be spent entertaining the audience or they will get bored. However, that amounts to naught if your audience can't be compelled by the characters. Sadly, AIC really dropped the ball when it came to fleshing out these characters, and that's truly disappointing to see. The original Persona 3 video game was never a marvel to look at when it launched in 2006. Being on the PlayStation 2, which was hardware in a world where the PlayStation 3 was spawned, didn't help either. Most of the environments were practically identical and generic, with the color palette being near non-existent when the social aspects of the game weren't presented. However, one area that it shined in was the art, with some pleasant-looking character designs and a wonderful UI that gave you plenty of, pardon the pun, personality and identity. The movie ditches the large amounts of cloudy grays and drab colors that were present in the game and instead ditches it for the expressive blues and greens that were only present in the game menus. There are also a wide variety of particle effects and gradients that give the presentation that extra oomph that you've seen from Memorial. Conversely, instead of the somewhat stylized, more anime look that the game embraced, the film has a more realistic look to it. Facial expressions have a lot of little details like biting lips and distraught expressions, and everyone does have somewhat realistic proportions. Ironically, the most obvious example of this realism is the personas themselves. Whenever they're on the screen, they move at a leisurely pace that gives them more weight and solidarity, and this also affects the action sequences by having them be rather slow as well. Objects like Yukari's arrows or spells and Persona's cast seem to take their time going across the screen, and when they impact the shadows, they phase through them like they're made from some sort of liquid-fluorescent material. Attention to detail is impeccable here, and there are several small touches that are sprinkled throughout the film. Clearly, the directors of this movie are fans of the game and, to some degree, want to give it justice. It's weird, isn't it? Whenever the movie should be focusing on explaining the story and character development, it cuts as many corners as it can. But whenever it needs action scenes, it takes its time and lingers on it. In summary, presentation is superb, and while it won't make you cry over how beautiful it looks, it's still extremely impressive for a movie based on a video game. Shoji Meguro, the composer for all the Persona games and most of the mainline Shin Megami Tensei titles, is in my humble opinion a musical genius. With the Persona titles, he blended several genres that I thought I didn't like and easily made some of the best soundtracks in gaming bar none. His unique riffs on rap and pop were an absolute breath of fresh air when I played the Persona games, and he can even make emotional and grandiose sound that will forever be imprinted in my brain. Hence, you should be surprised that much like how I felt about during Corb, I felt that Meguro was phoning in it a bit when with Spring of Birth soundtrack. I know he's a busy man working on 4 different Persona titles this year, 5 if you count the second movie, and that he probably has to put his priorities somewhere, but this soundtrack just didn't do it for me. Most of the music is subtle piano music and slight revisions of other game music. Listening to the soundtrack alone, the only ones that stood out to me were the main theme, More Than One Heart, and Persona Summoners, which are pretty good, but lose their luster after listening to them a couple times. But the soundtrack isn't terrible, it's just unremarkable. The only memorable moments being callbacks to the game's music. Also, a little nitpick here, but there was a disturbingly little amount of mass destruction, which I think only emerges once in the movie. Could you fix that next time, Meguro? As for the voice acting, well, it's Japanese and I can't speak Japanese, so it's okay, I guess. Although, once the dub comes, I'm pretty sure it's gonna be pretty stellar, like how most Atlas dubs are. Therefore, I would suggest you wait for the dub before watching this movie. So as far as Foley is concerned, it's pretty basic and has a few sprinkles here and there, though I don't think you're missing much if you decide to ignore the expensive collector's edition that comes with the soundtrack. Persona 3 Spring of Birth is a somewhat underwhelming piece of the film. While it has fantastic production values and a rabid fan base who will sing its praises to the end of time, it is still somewhat mediocre. Roughly combing over all the plot details at a breakneck pace and largely ignoring characterization to push it into the later films is something that will isolate those new to the series and who don't want to commit to a 100+ hour RPG. Yes, I know that anyone who would want to watch this film should play the games first, but it's still a fault of the movie for not bothering to keep those people in mind, especially for the first film in a trilogy that could possibly become a quadrilogy when all is said and done. Now that's the end of my summary, but I feel like there's a few personal issues that I need to address. I know for a fact that my opinion of this film is somewhat controversial and that I will be more than likely called out on this. Plus, I can already see the comments claiming that I truly don't appreciate Persona 3, that I'm not a true fan of the series, and yada yada yada. I did enjoy Persona 3, the game that is, immensely, and will one of these days sink as many hours into the portable version as I did with Bess. However, because of this, I think that the series deserves a better film than what we got. This film just relies too much on the fact that the audience play the game in order to completely understand what's going on, and much like Persona 4, the animation suffers for it. I'm not bashing this film because I hate Persona 3, and really I don't hate this film at all. I think it's just disappointing. This could have been a chance to draw people who normally don't play games into the series, but Atlas instead decided to stick too close to their fan base and consequently alienated outsiders. Is this a terrible film? No. Do I despise this film? No. Is this a subpar adaptation that will most likely be lost in this time and remembered as the one time they had a Persona movie? Unfortunately, yes. So, after being chased up to a roof by disturbing shadow creatures and shooting myself in the head while shouting Persona, I have acquired scores for story, characters, presentation, sound, and overall enjoyment. Beginning with story, which I give a completely average score of 5.0, being a rather mediocre start to a somewhat compelling tale. Up next, there's characters, which gets a disappointing 4.5 for not giving enough screen time to certain characters for us to care and making our protagonists an unlikable ass. Following characters is presentation, which gets a redeeming score of 8 points for having a solid and weighty animation style that looks extremely pleasing. Succeeding for presentation is sound, which gets a passable 6.5 for having a couple pleasant tracks but no real lasting impact. And finally, there's enjoyment, which also gets an adequate score of 6.0, being a not terrible Persona film, but really nothing else. Totaling all of these together and having Fuka analyze them, I ultimately come up with a score of 61%, and after much thought, giving the recommendation to stream/borrow it. I know, there's no legal way to stream this film, and as of this recording, September 2nd of 2014, it is sold out almost everywhere online. But unfortunately, I cannot recommend anyone to buy this film without at least previewing it first to know whether or not they like it. I really don't like to advocate methods as a way of obtaining a piece of media, but when the content is almost impossible to get a hold of, I think that method is somewhat justified. But knowing the publisher, restocks of the DVD and Blu-ray will probably come sometime in the future. Speaking of publishers, Persona 3 The Movie 1, Spring of Earth, was licensed by Aniplex. They'll be disappointed to know that they're keeping their reputation of having expensive physical releases, with the standard Blu-ray costing $60 US and the collector's edition costing $80. Keep in mind this review is done with the collector's edition Blu-ray of the film, that if you are given the options, you should probably go with that version due to the nice packaging that comes in and the soundtrack that is included. Now remember, that's only what's available now, and knowing the popularity of the series, it will most likely get a dub, and a very good dub at that, when all the films are released and available to the public, which more than likely won't be available until sometime in 2016, or possibly later. For other recommendations, well, I'll point you to anything else Persona related, be it video games, anime, maybe even drama CDs. Why? Because the series is absolutely fantastic, and it's a shame that this film seems to be the first black sheep to come out of the brand. Now with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you adieu, and I ask you to please comment about any issues you had with this video, because it will be much appreciated. Yes, even hateful comments about me, which will probably lead me to a depressing place, and I'll have to pull out the golden playthrough for the 5th time now. Oh, what's this video now? Oh, no? What's this? "2015, I am ready!"
Dream was down, ticking clock. I walk away from a soundless room. Windless night, moonlight nights. My ghostly shadow, just a